So world building around the Fatal Flaw or from the Fatal Flaw. I'll pick a preposition eventually. So let's start with who am I? What am I doing here? So again, I'm David R. Slayton. I'm the author of the Adam Binder novels from Blackstone Publishing. But I also have a bachelor's degree in history, focusing on ancient history in particular. And in studying ancient cultures, I focused on transitions between them, how the Roman Empire became the medieval Christian world, how the Greek Dark Ages happened when the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization led into the classical Greek age. And many people don't know that there are centuries there when writing vanished again in that culture. And I look for civilization changes and shifts because that's conflict, and that's always a really good place to write in as an author. You always want conflict and tension, right? And nothing's more tense than, hey, our whole civilization's falling apart around us. Something we might all be able to sympathize with a little too much right now, I think. So my debut was White Trash Warlock. It came out last October in 2020. And the sequel, Trailer Park Trickster, comes out this October. The third book, Deadbeat Druid, will be out in 2022. And if you want to connect with me on social media, you can find me anywhere. Just look for davidslayton.com or Google David R. Slayton. Just don't forget the R. There are a lot more David Slaytons out there than I ever realized when I started writing and wanting to publish. And now I might have gone with my pen name, but that's a conversation for a whole other day. So if you're going to traditionally publish, one of the things you might consider as a pen name, that's a whole other thing to talk about. But especially, there's some people on the internet you might want to hide from, that kind of stuff. Danielle and I could talk about that for a while. Okay, so why this workshop? Speculative fiction, fiction that deals with fictional worlds or worlds that don't exist in our reality, often overwrite. Meaning, how many of you, if you've written a fantasy novel or tried to start writing fantasy, you get engrossed in that world building, you get engrossed in trying to give all the details. And sometimes you give too much detail or the wrong kind, and you end up not either being able to make it a commercial success or sell it. This is probably one of the biggest things I see at writing conferences when I teach is, I've been working on this book for a long time. It's 200,000 words, 300,000 words. It's a massive book. It's very hard to debut with that. Traditional publishing is very sensitive to word count and size. When we think about epic fantasy and we think about big books, we tend to think Patrick Rothfuss or George R. R. Martin, not remembering that George R. R. Martin, the first book in Game of Thrones was like his 40th book. He was well into his career when that book came out, by I think about 30 some odd years. So your first book generally can't be that large, even if you're writing fantasy. And fantasy is a tough market to break into, but it can be done. And even if you intend to self-publish or go indie with it, the tighter read usually makes for a happier reader. And a happier reader will buy more books. Knowing when to cut and slice your series into smaller chunks can help make you more agile, a little faster when it comes to writing and publication. And in self-publishing, often having more books more quickly is the key. You want a catalog. You don't just want to have one book, then 10 years later. And if you see what's happening with some of those epic fantasy authors like Patrick Rothfuss or George R. R. Martin, those readers are tuning out because it's been too long. They're waiting and waiting to get a series, and they're getting frustrated because they may never get an end. Or I think about Robert Jordan, who passed away before he could finish The Wheel of Time, and Brandon Sanderson had to step in to complete the series for him. And often a lot of those extra words, if your word count's too high or your books are too big, are devoted to world building. So I started trying to think of ways to isolate, to distill the thesis of a story down. How can I make the world building more narrow and really try to focus on what drives the conflict in the world? So I just want to give you, for our time together, some ideas to think about what could narrow your world building to center a crucial flaw or a single conflict that informs the story's tension. Especially if you're writing a series. You might be writing a series along the lines of something where there's a larger conflict that isn't going to get resolved in, right away. I'm going to move you all to the top so I stop looking down at you. Actually, I'm just going to minimize cameras because they're kind of distracting. All right. You're over here, though, so I'll trust Danielle or Ren to let me know if there is anything in the chat. So what is the fatal flaw? The fatal flaw is an incurable problem. It's the thing that drives the issues and conflict in your world. It's the imperfection that makes your world believable. Now, the flaw might be resolved in the series conclusion, but that's doubtful. The flaw is usually a condition of the world. It's a driving force behind global or higher conflict. And if you need to think of some examples, all you have to do is look out the window or go to your news. I'm in Colorado right now, where the smoke from the fires on the West Coast is clouding the air. Even though I'm in Denver, we were told on Saturday we had the worst air in the world at the time on Saturday. And that is tough, because that basically indicates to you that, you know, the effects of climate change, the effects of what's going on outside, those fires are affecting me all the way here, even though I'm hundreds and hundreds of miles away from them. My friends on the East Coast have been dealing with them blowing over on across the continent to them. So you can easily think about the world. War has been a constant state in our lives since 9/11. We're at this time, as of today, we are just now starting to end our engagement in Afghanistan after all these years. Racism, that's something from current events that has been such an important conversation in the American consciousness in the last year. Plague, sickness, illness, obviously with COVID, income inequality, religious persecution, resource scarcity. All of these things could be a crucial issue. And we'll look at some examples of books that draw on this shortly. Any of these kinds of things could be a world level conflict, something that makes a good backdrop for your story and gives it that crucial element that it's kind of realistic. And that crucial element is called verisimilitude. And what is that? It is an adjective meaning which is the quality of being versimilar, which does not help us at all. It's the appearance of truth. So every fantasy, no matter how wild and wonderful and strange, needs to have the appearance of truth, meaning that your readers could believe it is really going to happen to them. It needs to depict realism in a way that for your reader, they can pick up on it. And now is a good time to talk about things that you may want to consider steering away from. For example, it's very easy when I say this. I teach this at a lot of writing conferences. I talk to a lot of fantasy authors. And one of the first things they'll bring up is Game of Thrones and the copious amounts of rape, which are more present, I think, in the television show than it is in the books, if I recall. I gave up on the show after a while, so I couldn't tell you. I gave up on the books too. But when I say what, and I would read beta submissions, or I'd read submissions from authors, say, what's going on with all the rape? Why are you putting all this in? They would say, well, that makes it realistic. That's how it was in the Middle Ages. And then I have to put on my historian hat and say, no, that's not true. Also, you could find other things. While, for example, if you just watch the recent Shadow and Bone series on Netflix, they injected racism into the story, which the books didn't have originally. And it was very interesting to have them put something different into it. So while you might want to include conflicts that are real, because many of us do deal with racism, we do deal with these issues, it's okay to reach for new things too. I personally prefer my fantasy worlds to have different conflicts. I don't want to reach for some of those things. I want to kind of move beyond them if I can. I'm not saying that those things don't happen, but you don't necessarily want to make them the center of what's going on with your flaw. So as you look for things to give it the appearance of truth, don't feel the need to gloss over or erase real world problems like racism. That's absolutely something that occurs. At the same time, you don't have to make that your choice, your flaw. You can use other things. I just want to encourage you to kind of be creative with it. All right, let's go forward. Where is my mouse? It's here somewhere. Okay, let me reach for the keyboard. Okay, so the incurable central issue, the fatal flaw, will deepen it and give the reader engagement, because your book has to have conflict. If you were ever to write a book where everything is perfect, it's complete utopia and no one struggles with anything, it's not going to be believable. And it's going to be kind of boring. Did anybody watch The Matrix way back when? Did anybody watch all three Matrix movies? We kind of pretend in this house there's only one, but I did watch the others. And you might have remembered there's a subtext there. In The Matrix, they first tried to make one that was in a utopia. Everything was perfect and everybody was happy. And it failed because people wouldn't fall for it. They wouldn't stay asleep, right? The utopia wasn't realistic. Human beings always have a little bit of conflict in us. We're almost never 100% one thing or another. And that's true for your characters. Your characters are never completely one thing. I really encourage you to delve into the psychology of your characters. Give them layers. Nobody is one thing all the time. You might be an incredibly nice humanitarian who has a bad day and yells at a puppy. That's a sort of silly example, right? People who talk about Mother Teresa said she could be quite cross and cranky with people. She wasn't always a very nice person, even though she was Mother Teresa. Hitler was a vegetarian painter. Nobody is just one thing. Now, obviously, those domineering traits of being somebody saintly might be the thing that gives them their identity. It might be who they are, Mother Teresa. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that she's the perfect person every day, right? Nobody is always one thing. So give your characters and your worlds realism in a way that belief will sustain their interest. And we'll talk a little bit more about contrast in a bit. And you can't swing too far in one direction or the other. And we'll talk about grimdark. Does everyone know what grimdark fantasy is? It's okay if you don't. Excellent. Okay. We'll get to that in a little bit. But if your world is too perfect or your world is too bleak, you lose readers. You can't have it be just, oh, this is ideal, there's no conflicts. And you can't have it be just nothing but terror and horror and misery all the time. There has to be a middle ground. And that's the other example from The Matrix, is there was another Matrix, an older one, where they made it a nightmare world. And it failed because it was too terrifying for people to sustain it. So your world needs things to make it feel real to the reader. And no matter how great it can be, there has to be something a little bit wrong with it. Even the richest person in the world still fears death. All men must die. All humans meet their end. They can't escape it. And no amount of money will solve that. Money would solve all those other problems, and maybe it'll prolong your life due to healthcare and food, but it's not going to keep you alive forever. Everybody has to face death at some point. The fatal flaw is the thing that no one can fix. Okay. So the best way to write fiction that works, in my opinion, I need to move the cameras because I can't see my slides, even though I kind of know them. Whoa, too far. Examples, not yet. I like seeing your faces, so I'm going to try to keep you, but I'm going to try to make you a little smaller. All right, there. The best way to write fiction that works, in my mind, is to study fiction that works. If you read a book and you fall in love with it, and it's like, man, that was believable. That world was believable. That writer did that well. Study that book. If you want to write epic fantasy, find 3 epic fantasies that you like. They don't even necessarily have to be good. And I do encourage you, if it's your first book, to get first books. Don't get Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn, get Elantris, his first book that sold. Study first books. Go back to older works, earlier works, because again, if you're trying to model against that massive 250,000 word tome that somebody's doing later in their career, you might be biting off a little too much. Roll back. Go for earlier books that sold and did well. It's basically, this is my advice for almost every workshop. I always copy this advice because I think it's so useful, and it's the thing that taught me so much. Is find 3 books in the genre you want to write, whether it's urban fantasy, epic fantasy, romantic comedy, whatever you want to write. And that can be free. You can get them with a library card. Or if you can buy cheap copies, which I really like to do, I will take an X-Acto knife and I'll cut the books up. And I do that so that I can dissect them literally. And I will go through and chart word count. I will write plot. Break those books down. Look for the fatal flaw. Look at the world building. Look at how the book, what makes the book successful to you? Why is it compelling? Why did this book sell? And if it's a bestseller, why did it sell so many copies? Like, what was so entrancing about this book that it caught readers' attention? So it's important that if you want to write, and I don't believe there are many laws in writing. I don't believe that, again, if anyone ever comes to you and says, this is the way to do it, the only way, usually I would recommend that you run away from that person. Right? There's no absolute path to being a writer and to being the writer that you're going to be. It's a process is incredibly personal, and your journey there is incredibly personal. Some of the worst things I've run into in my life is when I've listened to somebody else when my gut told me that wasn't the right advice. But if I was going to say this is what I think people should try as a successful technique, it's this. Find 3 books in the genre you want to write, break them apart, outline them. I use Microsoft Excel. I get word count, plot. I put columns for all that stuff, and I just break it down. How does this work? And if I see world building, I'll put a column or 2 in for world building and look at how the fatal flaw is there. Look at how that thesis or that idea is informing it. And if you do that for 3 books in your chosen genre before you start, you will learn so much about how to write a book and how to architect a novel. So many of us, writing is very exciting, especially when you sit down and you're like, I just want to put my world on the page. I want to get started. And honestly, sometimes it's the wrong place. You need to know what you're doing really before you begin. It's kind of like building a house and you just start putting walls up and realize you didn't know how to do that. So it can be very helpful if you take your time and try to study an architect before you write. I would have saved a lot of time if I'd begun with that model for myself. It took me a lot longer to publish than I wanted. So let's talk about some examples and think about fatal flaws. And if you have a favorite book in fantasy, think about what the fatal flaw would be. Harry Potter, it's racism, in my opinion. I think that's the fatal flaw because it's what drives the world's conflict, right? Voldemort and his followers are against, they're against half-breeds. They're against, they want only pure blood magicians to be in charge. The class issues that are inside the world that J.K. Rowling built are related to that racism. The way that Draco goes after Hermione, the way that her relationship is later on when things turn very, very dark and you see mudbloods, there's a slur to identify them, somebody who has Muggle parents, to have them, or half-blood, as we later learn that Snape is. We see these slurs come out. We see the racism take a language form and have terms. And we see the effect as those characters are being literally persecuted later on in the series, as they're being driven away and out of the magical community. So I think for Harry Potter, it's very easy. Racism is the fatal flaw. I think that's an easy one to spot. If you look at movie examples, I try to lean into books as opposed to movies because we're writers who write books. Star Wars, fascism, right? That's a pretty simple one. It's basically World War II in space. Dune, which has a new movie coming out in a couple of months. This one's easy, resource scarcity. The spice is the thing that only allows intergalactic travel, and it's rare, it's only produced on one planet. The entire scarcity of that resource drives the entire plot, all the political machinations, drives all the main trouble in Dune is caused by the scarcity of the resource of spice. And by the end of the book, everything that happens in Dune, the issue of spice scarcity is not resolved. And these books have gone on for a long time. Well after Frank Herbert died, his son has co-written other books have been written in the universe. This issue of the scarcity is always there. It never resolves. And if you think back to Harry Potter, does Voldemort's defeat and restoration of order, does that end racism in the magical world? No, of course not. That fatal flaw is not resolved. It'd be nice if it did, but of course it's not. I used to get really frustrated with Star Wars because it's all, they just built another Death Star. We've seen this before, guys. Oh, they built another Death Star. Do something new. But the more I thought about it, I realized that's generally how life works. Um, we had World War II. We thought Nazis were gone. And then a couple of years ago, Nazis were back. And we're like, what? Didn't we just do this? Um, Death Stars, they will always build more Death Stars. The Fatal Flaw will always rise up in these ways. And it always has to be beaten down. So the Fatal Flaw won't be resolved by this, usually won't be resolved by this story arc, by this series, by these heroes. It'll probably come back again tomorrow and need a new generation of heroes to try to resolve it. And spoiler alert, they probably won't succeed. That problem of resource scarcity, for example, is likely going to be a problem again and again. And throughout the Dune series, there are individuals who constantly try to solve the problems by scarcity. They kidnap the worms, take them to other planets where they can't survive. They try cloning, they try all these things to solve this problem. And so one question that Stevie's asking is, do fatal flaws ever resolve? Realistically thinking, everything is always changing, but can a story seem to resolve one? Yes, they can. And I personally think that that can be a really good day. I like happy endings, and I like it when the good guys win a lot. Usually at a cost, because I feel like good endings have a sacrifice, but Lord of the Rings, the ring is destroyed, Sauron is vanquished. And as far as we know, that's it for him. So there could be a final victory at some point that does the job. And it depends on what kind of story you're trying to write. Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn trilogy, the initial books, resolve their fatal flaw at the end of the third book. It's a big world shifting change that sweeps everything away. And it's catastrophic, it's cataclysmic in the way that it changes the world. I think it's a fantastically written series, by the way. I like those first three books. I didn't go further than that. I was kind of good. Like, that was all I really wanted. But yeah, you can have a time when the fatal flaw gets resolved. And again, I don't mind. I like heroic endings. I like it if I would like racism to go away. I think that'd be pretty cool. Climate fiction is very hot right now. A lot of people are writing it. N.K. Jemisin's fifth season is a world-breaking moment. Climate change and massive changes sweeping the world that she's created. Incredible book, by the way. Incredible series. But the fatal flaw has been building. I'll borrow again from climate change in Game of Thrones. Winter is coming, right? Winter has come before. We survived it before, but maybe this one's going to be worse. The fatal flaw, the change, is exacerbated or mitigated by individual actions, but the season would have come regardless. For her world, the fifth season is still going to happen. You're not going to stop it, but we don't have to speed it up. We don't have to make it be worse. So while the fatal flaw is world level, our actions as individuals and characters could be affecting the impact of it upon us. It's also you can see characters reacting to the flaw in ways of how they choose to behave. So if you have something like, a sweeping change is coming over the world, some people might choose to band together and try to make things better. Some people might choose to say, hey, this is a great opportunity to seize power. All the different ways that somebody might react to that. There's a fantastic video game, Dragon Age, and in Dragon Age, the country is beset by basically zombie apocalypse, for lack of a better term, but an outbreak from the underworld. And one of the characters has this great comment where she says, because everyone decided that the Blight is a perfect time to start killing each other. Right? We should all be fighting against this. Instead, we're fighting each other over these old political squabbles and battles we've been having. And I think that's such an amazing comment, right? Because we're all like, why are we doing this now? This isn't a good time, guys. I think you're focusing on the wrong thing. And I think climate fiction, it's very topical. We're all thinking about it in many ways, again, as the world outside my window is burning, or the cataclysmic fires from Greece, if you saw the footage this weekend. But how people respond, it displaces people, it creates things. Resource scarcity becomes very different in that term because you have large groups of people trying to go elsewhere. The Mortal Instruments, for another young adult example. I think race is basically the flaw in this world as well. You have people who have angelic blood, and you have people who do not. But I think that the class issue in the Mortal Instruments is deeper because you have the downworlders, you have people with demonic, the warlock race inside of all of this versus the shadow hunters themselves, who are very classist because they have angelic blood and they think of themselves as, holy in a way, and that leads to oh, thank you, Daniel. Having two screens can be a downside. But just to finish that thought, so you can lead to that very kind of lawful good when following the law and trying to be holy can be dangerous. Look at the Crusades. No, let me get back to Stevie's comment. Sorry, Stevie. So what I mean is, we know there was a win, but the society is still the same, living the same habits. Can a story end with more than the win in thought? I'd like to. I'd like to think that a victory could. I'm a cynical historian, right? Like, I've seen oh, we thought World War I was going to be it. Like, wait, we had to have another. Come on. By the way, I talk with my hands. If you ever need to kidnap me, you don't need to gag me. Just handcuff me, and that's it. I won't be able to speak. If that hasn't been clear already, but I would like that. I think it's an optimistic ending, and I would love to read more endings like that, right? Where people see the error of their ways and change. Wonder Woman 1984. Did anybody watch that? I really liked that. The way that Diana, spoiler alert, the way that Diana won that conflict was to show people to turn aside from their selfish wants, their selfish wishes. And Diana didn't really win that battle. The people did, because the people put aside the selfish and dark things they had wanted for, and that fixed the problem. Even the main villain had a redeeming moment. So yeah, I love stories like that where the resolution can make a societal change or make a wider spread change. And that's fundamental to who Wonder Woman is as a character, that she was born out of trying to rehabilitate people, trying to rehabilitate her villains. And I've always liked that about her story. A lot of her villains over the years have been sent to live on Paradise Island, where the Amazons try to help them become better people. And I think that's a really cool idea. But I like a story where can the win be more than just momentary? And I think that kind of hope punk or hopeful ending, I absolutely think there's a place for stories like that. I certainly want to read more of them. Let's see. Again, bit of a soapbox moment. Already kind of did it, but feel free to be original. You don't have to be historically accurate. As people always tell me, well, we've got to have these problems. We've got to have racism and sexism and homophobia and all these things. Spoiler alert, we didn't have dragons. So you don't have to be historically accurate. No one says fantasy needs to be historically accurate. And oftentimes when you're including these things, you're not actually being historically accurate. You're copying what someone else thought was historically accurate, and you're replicating that mistake. Especially warfare in the Crusades is largely misunderstood in this time in medieval war. So yeah, especially I hear this all the time when I see a Game of Thrones. Someone's trying to write Game of Thrones, and it's and that gets into the grimdark, where give me some hope. Give me somebody I want to read about. I don't want to read about jerks for 800 pages. That's my personal taste in fiction. I don't like grimdark. Grimdark is bleak. The heroes are usually bad guys. If you're looking for a very recent comp to that, Suicide Squad. They're criminals and jerks, and they're saving the day. It tends to be a very jaded take on heroism or anti-heroes. And personally, I read a lot of speculative fiction because I want to escape reality. I live with homophobia. I live in a world with racism and sexism and all these other problems. I would like to be in a world where I can at least get away from that stuff that I have to deal with every day and still have flaws and conflicts to give me realism, to give me verisimilitude. But I want to escape at least some of those day-to-day, pains that we all have to deal with.
You said on your slide to create a world where your readers don't have to face the same stuff where the flaw is different. Do you have an example of a book that does that, where the flaw is maybe not one of the things we talked about?
Sure. My friend Barbara Ann Wright, she writes a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, and she writes for a company called Bold Stroke Books that largely publishes gay fiction, mostly lesbian. And in her worlds that she creates, there's no homophobia. She doesn't have to deal with that. Afrofuturism as a genre, which you see with like Wakanda and Black Panther, worlds where you're dealing with high-tech African-based societies. They're doing really well. They tend to have, racism tends not to be a factor for them. But they have other flaws. They have other conflicts. I thought Black Panther did an amazing job of showing Wakanda almost as a utopia inside of itself, but then having to face what happens when you go outside of it, which is all kind of one of the themes of the movie, I thought, of we're getting beyond our utopia, but there is that racism and those conflicts outside of it. And that's such a nice way of contrasting things. Like they did such a great job in that movie of the Wakandans had a point. The villain, Killmonger, he had a point. Magneto in the X-Men. Magneto, yes, he's a terrorist. He's done terrible things. He's just trying to protect his people in his mind. He's not a villain. And that's a way, again, to kind of create characters and antagonists or villains who aren't just single-sided. I call them mustache twirlers. They're those villains that get up and go, waha, I am evil and I shall be evil today for evil's sake, waha. Like, nobody's like that. They all think they're the hero in their mind. They think they're saving the world. No, they might be insane. They might be, be a malignant narcissist. They might think that they might not be in touch with reality, but they don't think they're evil. Bad people don't wake up every day and think, I'm going to be bad today. That's not their function. They think they're saving the world. They think they're a good person. And they'll go to the end thinking they were right. And they might have a point. Killmonger kind of had a point. Magneto kind of has a point. They're still bad people who do bad things, and that's not to be argued with. But that little bit of sympathy, that little bit of contrast makes them so much more interesting than if they're just somebody who's just evil. That motivation. And there's kind of talked about all this already, but I just want to point out this one line here. Even a character who is unaware of or even oblivious to the flaw is going to be affected by it because it's at the world level. Let's go back for a sec. I think it comes up in a bit. Let's talk about Harry. Harry is magical royalty. He's pure blood. He has all that money his parents left him. Yes, he has the tragic backstory of the dead parents and all that. But ultimately in the wizarding world, he's known before he arrives. He has advantages that are granted to him and a certain amount of privilege because of the flaw. If he was a half-blood or born from muggles, how would he have been received at Hogwarts? What's the first thing Draco tries to do? He tries to recruit Harry to his side, to his cause. You belong with us. You're one of us. And what's the first thing Harry does? He buys Ron sweets. And that is a pet the dog moment or a pet the cat moment. Does anyone know what those are? It's okay if you don't. All right, so these are really important. Early on in your work, it's very common to have either a pet the dog moment or a kick the dog moment. And that's going to tell me who that character is. When Ron sees the sweet cart and can't afford the sweets because he's poor, which is part of the classism. Now, that's not tied to the flaw of racism, but it's still a problem in the world. He sees those sweets and wants them. That tells you something about Ron. He's too poor to afford them. Harry buys the sweets and shares them with Ron. And that tells you something about Harry. That's a pet the dog moment. And that refers to the idea of if your character's walking down the street and they see a stray dog, do they pet it or do they kick it? Are they oblivious to it? How your character reacts early on to a moment like that can tell us so much about them. So the fact that Harry buys the sweets for Ron, Harry has the privilege. He's pure blood. He has the money. He could have sided with Draco. He could have been like, oh, I want to be with this in crowd. If Draco had been in that situation, he might have bought the sweets and thrown them out the window, right? Or bought them all and given them to his crew and not shared. And sometimes it can be very helpful to think about how your protagonist versus your antagonist would handle it, even if they're not in the scene. Just writing a little test scene like that. A stray dog crosses their path. What does your hero do? What does your villain do? And if you can somehow find a way to tie that into the flaw, then that might even tell you a little bit more. What if that had been Hermione? What if that had been the moment that we'd figured out that there's this whole idea of mudbloods and Muggle-born wizards, right? Now that might be a little too obvious. One of the things that J.K. Rowling is extremely good at is using a character to tell you about another character without saying it directly. And if you ever are writing something like property-based fiction, where you have to write about a character that you didn't create, like you're writing a Star Wars book or a comic book for a character like Wonder Woman, you can get, there's a sneaky trick of having another character say something to express something about that iconic character that will stop you from having to change the iconic character, because it's perception by a secondary or tertiary character that could simply be wiped out by another writer later if necessary. It's a sneaky little trick. I picked it up in reading comic books, but it's a really clever way to look at using one character to tell you about your main character. But that action of buying the sweets, that's a pet the dog moment. Harry's a good person. He's generous. So how does your character relate to the flaw? Does it benefit them? Even if they're not aware of it? Like Harry, again, he has some privilege from being pure blood, even though he doesn't even know what that means when he arrives. Does it hurt them? You know, if you walk into the room and you suddenly are getting a reaction because of who you are, but you don't even know where it's coming from. If they know it exists, how do they feel about it? For Harry, that's an instinctive moment when he sees what happens with Hermione, I believe in book 2. But how does he react? How do they react when they learn about it? And that tells you something else too about society and their place in it. This is incredibly important to think about. Let's say that I'm having a conversation with Stevie and someone passes by and makes a comment. And maybe it's not about us, but it's about somebody in a way, how we react. Hey, that's not okay. Hey, that's not cool. What are you doing? You know, how we react to that third person can tell you something. If Stevie shuts them down and I stay quiet, that tells you something about me and tells you something about Stevie. And it gives you a little bit of depth into us. What price do they pay for the flaw, if they pay one? All these are things you can think about of, if you have a flaw in your world and then you start steeping it in this way. I recently wrote a fantasy novel that I hope we sell soon, where There's no moon at night. The world doesn't have a moon. That means that the night is very dark. It's a low medieval world. There's no electrical lighting or gas. And unfortunately, there are blood-hungry ghosts that prowl the darkness, which means that if you don't have light, you're in literal danger. But my main character can see in the dark. And that changes his whole relationship to the darkness that for everyone else is this deadly threat. He's the only person who can navigate it safely and hide, because he doesn't need a torch. He doesn't need a light or a candle. So how does the flaw empower them or disempower them? And if you're making beat sheets for your characters, and a beat sheet is just a one sheet of all your character traits, I usually try to give them, I try to keep summaries because I lose track of who's got what eye color and all that, which is hilarious because I was halfway through writing book 2, and I couldn't remember what Adam's eye color was. Like, I thought it was blue, but maybe I changed it to green at one point. I had to go back and reread book 1 to find it. Take notes, it will save time, I promise. I thought I could keep it all in my head. Nope, I thought I might have changed it. But if you write a beat sheet, just a one sheet of all those main traits of them, put some character traits down too. Put some positives and some negatives. Again, even your hero or your heroine has flaws. Adam is very cocky. That leads him into trouble. He makes a mistake early on in White Trash Warlock that changes the course of his life forever. And if he hadn't been so cocky, it wouldn't have happened. But also, if you're putting a flaw into your world, put down some notes on your beat sheet about how the flaw can empower them or detract from their power. What's their relationship to the world? So you can build your world around the flaw. You can architect it. Again, Dune, that's such a great example. The scarcity of the spice, the entire galactic power structure is built around this one planet, Arrakis. The source of the spice, the limits of the spice, the entire galactic power structure is built around that. The Empire in Star Wars. It doesn't matter how far you are out on the fringe, the Empire is affecting you. Luke could not be further away on Tatooine when everything starts up. But unfortunately, it's a problem. Han, when we first meet Han, he owes money to Jabba the Hutt because he had to drop his smuggling stash because of the Empire. Even though he's not Imperial, he's not a rebel, he could not be further from attached to the Empire in any way, but it's still affecting him. The fascism of the Empire is still affecting him. Talked enough about Harry Potter, I think. It's I have to use it. I just feel like I have to use it because it's such a commonly known example, right? Everyone knows it. No matter where you fit right now with J.K. Rowling, and many of us are like, man, lady, which is unfortunate. But at the same time, it's like, that's such a universal example. I'm trying to find something that's just as well known, but I don't like leaning into Star Wars because I prefer books to movies for you. Because I feel like if you're going to write books, you should read books. So again, the flaw empowers some people. So going back to Harry Potter, Umbridge. Much of Umbridge's power comes from the fact that she embraces that racism. Other people pay a price for it. Some people like Snape might be able to pass or move between the two. We had a fairly racist kind of moment come up in my day job fairly recently. And I affected coworkers. It didn't affect me because I don't share the identity and experience of those coworkers. At the same time, I had to make a choice. How do I respond to this? Right? Where do I stand? And as a gay man, I can pass as straight if I need to. If I really want to, I can hide that about my identity. That's something to think about in your world. If the flaw is affecting you, how do you can people pass? Can they move back and forth? Are they scared? Or does the flaw cause them to want to hide? Can they get away with hiding? Is there an event that happens where they finally can't hide anymore? So as you're writing your books, if you're plotting them, I strongly encourage these kinds of questions. Ask yourself the hard questions. Ask your characters the hard questions. We all like to think what we do when times are tough or when things are rough. But do we? Will we? What does your character do? If your character is seeing somebody taken away by the Empire, what do they do? Do they regret their choice? How far is your character willing to go? And if you really want to mix it up, does your villain make the right choice sometimes? Think about all those times when you have seen a character who is a bad guy, but darn it, they do that one good thing. That can be really compelling for your villain to sometimes be a good person. Not all the time, because they're still the villain. But you can really get some interesting conflicts and layers. I've been watching a lot of movies lately. I've been trying to study more fiction. And sometimes I just really want the happier, brighter side, but it always is interesting to me when the villains are just evil, or they're boring to me because they don't have sympathy. I can't empathize with their actions. But sometimes the villain will do something like, okay, I don't like him, but I can see where he's coming from. So asking your characters questions, lots of questions. I have it around here somewhere. It's over in my writing shelf. Do you remember the book of questions from the early 90s? It was like a party game. Everybody had a little pocket paperback. Your library probably has it. I got one super cheap off Amazon for like $1. It's just a book of hard questions. And when I'm trying to figure out who a character is, I will sit down and just randomly flip it open and ask my hero 5 difficult questions. And then I write down how they would answer, because that tells me who they are. And then I sit down and I do that for the villain. And sometimes the villain surprises me. Sometimes they're not all bad. And that creates contrast. If there's one thing I can encourage you to do, and again, there are no hard rules in writing, but there are no laws of writing, as it were, it's to play amateur psychiatrist, play therapist with your characters. Get in their heads, get in their hearts. How do they feel? Why do they feel? What do they feel? Think of yourself with them on the couch. And how do you feel about that? But the fatal flaw, and the key point is, it's a condition of the world. It does not end when the conflict ends, usually. It may slink into the background, the Death Stars. And again, there's your Star Wars. So for practice, what I'd encourage you to do, and we'll take a minute here because we have plenty of time. We still have, we got about 30 minutes. And I never want a death by PowerPoint. I encourage you to write down a fatal flaw for your world, something the heroes can't defeat by the end of book 1. And again, going back to Stevie's question, if you're writing a trilogy, maybe it's resolved at the end of book 3. That's how it worked in Mistborn, and I thought Brandon Sanderson did a really good job with that. Think about how it affects the characters. I've encouraged you to do that already. Think about how it affects the world. Like, for example, in the book that I was telling you about that I wrote, the areas of the world, the richer people have whale oil. Light becomes very expensive. Candles become incredibly expensive. But the rich people are going to be fine for now. They have light. The poor people are burning their furniture. Think about the blizzard we had in Texas recently, which was so unaccustomed. It's a good example. That was a really interesting case of how people reacted. Some people had the money to flee. Some people could fly somewhere much warmer. Some people were trapped. They were having to use water, thaw water in the rare points that they could. Some people were breaking down their fences to burn them for heat or their furniture. If your flaw reaches in that extreme boiling over point, it can take that form. And socioeconomic background is going to make a big difference in how you can respond to it. Governments, corporations, refugees, villains, they're just people. They're responding to something. We're very responsive, reactive creatures. We're very fight or flight. We may not be very self-aware sometimes, but often their reactions to the flaw are just driven by that, again, by that psychology. So the more that you know, the more you're in their head and heart, the more you can write a realistic response to how they would handle something. And again, how does the flaw flow in the background? I feel like I've beaten a lot of this to death, so I'll move on. In Shadow Hunters, Jace has an extra dose of angel blood. That makes him more powerful as a shadow hunter. He's considered one of the best shadow hunters because he has extra angel blood, which just tells you right there, he's got more of it. It creates that lawful good or conservative society. When Alec, who's a shadow hunter, falls in love with a warlock, Magnus, this is a massive problem. The fact that Magnus is a warlock is almost far more important. I think it's about the same level, same as him being a male. The fact that Magnus is a man, but because he's a warlock, he's a downworlder. He has a different heritage. And again, the flaw doesn't have to be a bad thing. Being pureblood probably has some privileges for Harry that he's not taking into account. And there could be a self-realization for them of that. What if Alec was the one with the extra angel blood and he has always enjoyed a little bit of honor because of it? What if he has to stop and think about what that means for Magnus? Just avoid the whole savior complex, please. You don't want your hero to be like, oh, I will come in and save you, person who has a different experience than me. Don't do that. Again, there are no rules, but these are David's guidelines. Sometimes it's more interesting if your character is not the downtrodden. I really like underdog characters. I like people who struggle, but again, I like characters who have a superpower, who have a little bit of something. I do like underdogs, but it can be interesting if your character isn't an underdog in every way. So think about your secondary characters, not just your hero, your heroine, or your antagonist, your villain. Think about some of the other people around them. Think about how the flaw affects them. Since I guess I'm just going to be all about Harry Potter today, how does it affect Ron? How does it affect Hermione? If I go back to Shadowhunters, Jace has extra angel blood. Alec does not. Alec's sister does not. Isabel. Did they get a different perspective than Jace? We really like fish out of water stories. We seem to be drawn to those as a culture. And you often get characters who are experiencing the world, and Shadowhunters is on my mind because Clary wasn't raised in that world, even though she's from it. So she steps in and finds herself part of all this political structure and things. And she, like Jace, has extra angel blood. She's more on that higher level, but she's not conscious of it when she first arrives in that world. So there's a conversation there around power that she walks in and just immediately starts to figure out and find things, and she's being exposed to all this stuff. Oh, and just that last note, what do the secondary or tertiary characters see that the main character can't? Upstairs, downstairs, right? If you think about different class differences, what's obvious to somebody who is in a different class than your main character? Sometimes the heroes are up on their perch and they can't see everything. Sometimes it takes a street level character to be like, hey, you're missing this detail. Once you've got some ideas around the flaw and how it impacts your world and characters, then start thinking about the story. Does it affect your plot? Is it part of your plot? Is it just background? That whole thing about a world without a moon, that might just be background in my book. The spice in Dune, it's really the struggles inside the different houses and how they're fighting for control of the planet, but the scarcity of the flaw is just always there. It doesn't have to necessarily be the driver for your plot, but it can make your world unique. Yeah, we did that already. So keep thinking about those secondary characters. Write them down. Try to demonstrate the impact of the flaw on them. If you're writing a world, which I think is very common, of who has magic, who does not have magic, that's a very common trope in fantasy. Is there a benefit to not being the most powerful? I can get more done because I'm not as obvious. I don't shine as bright. That's something I played with a lot in White Trash Warlock. Adam is not powerful. He has just a little magic, and it puts him at risk. But because he's under the radar, he can get away with a lot of things a lot of people can't. And he can see things that are hiding down there at his level. Sometimes a secondary or tertiary character, again, because the light isn't so bright on them, they can do some really cool stuff. We'll go old school. Buffy, Willow. I always thought Willow was way more interesting than Buffy, right? Buffy's the superhero, but Willow had a lot more to struggle with.
Oh, yeah.
I say,
well, yeah. No question. Okay, so could you have, let's say you had like one world that was divided into two, because maybe, you know, one half has something the other doesn't. Obviously, and there's like one fatal flaw that affects in both of them, but maybe it's different for both sides. Can that be a thing? Or do they each have their own fatal flaw that's caused from this central thing that affects both of them? Can you do it that way? Does it matter? What would you do in those? I don't know.
It depends on what you want the conflict to be. If those two sides of that world, so I'm just pulling stuff out of the air. A world where the planet doesn't rotate enough and it has seasons. So one world is always summer and one world's always winter. But the flaw is starting to affect things where everything is going to become one or the other. Let's go with summer, since again, everything's on fire outside our doors. The people of winter might realize that the summer people are causing all this, that, you know, we're going to attack. You guys have done enough. We've had enough. It could be one flaw. It depends on what you want to set up. You could also get a great fish out of water if I travel from one world that has this problem to this other world that has a completely different problem. And maybe I'm useless in my world, but I'm helpful over there. Or maybe I'm originally from there, and what was a handicap where I have lived most of my life is actually a blessing. Why did I have to flee? What took me out of that world? What brought me here? There are so many different ways you can play that. Find the one that's most interesting to you. Find the thing that you want to spend 100,000 words with. Because when you write a book, you are going to have to read it a billion times. You're going to have to write it. You're going to have to edit it. You're going to have to polish it. You're going to have to query it. When you sell it, you're going to get edits so many times. I am so sick of White Trash Warlock at this point, but I still have to read it one more time for book 3 at least. If we get more, I'll have to read it again. Don't get me wrong. I love it. It's like my firstborn kid, right? I always love it. But you want something that's going to compel you. And if you can latch onto the angle that you find the most interesting, your readers will find that the most interesting. You want the thing that gets you excited to write about. And that's just true. Don't write what you think is going to sell the best. Vampires are back. I'm going to write a vampire book. Unless you really want to write a vampire book. Don't chase the market. You'll make yourself crazy. Try to write what you love, and that will show. So whatever angle you see there, use that one. Whatever you see, like, ooh, that's the one that sometimes it's not our first idea. Like you have to kind of like play with, like write down a few and then play with it and then let's sit up, sleep on it, think about it. Like find the thing that gets you the most compelling, but yeah, take your time with it. Don't rush to write. Take the time.
In the chat, Stevie mentioned Fringe, and that's a great example because the TV show Fringe, like they have a lot of flaw.
Yes.
Thank you, Stevie.
Yeah, how the worlds are affecting each other from being linked. The Dark Material series. You know, how dust is affecting things. Is dust the flaw? Is it a benefit, or is it just a background trait? And then how, if you haven't read it, I won't spoil it, but how it all resolves in the end. That's tragic and beautiful and heartbreaking. All right, so this is a good time to talk about contrast. We've got about 25 minutes left. So I asked you if you read Grimdark already. So Grimdark is, for me, again, not my friend. It's too dark, too bleak. But what power would hell have if those imprisoned here were not able to dream of heaven? Even the ugliest place has a little beauty. You can't have shadows without some kind of light. Even in Mordor, there are flowers. Talked about this already with the contrast and the sweets, enough for that example. But if your world is a utopia, try to show the bad side. It's a beautiful book by my friend Serena Dahlin called Reset that came out recently. And in it, it's a utopia, or is it a dystopia, where every number of years, society resets everyone's memory. Because they feel like if you do that, you can't have war or conflict or prejudice, because I think it's 4 years is her time frame. And they're asking this question of how long. But then there are people who kind of start to remember bits or miss the lives they had or want to know. She's asking some really beautiful questions about what makes us us. But even in this utopia where there's no war or no starvation or anything, there's still sadness. Did anybody watch The Good Place? I love that show. It's really brilliant. It's moral philosophy posing as a dumb sitcom. And my favorite thing in all of entertainment is smart and sexy that poses as dumb and dopey, and The Good Place is it. But there's this really beautiful moment about every human being is always a little sad because they know that the happiness has to end. And I think that's such a beautiful way of covering that little contrast. Even the darkest world has some light, has some beauty. And even the world that is the most perfect utopia has something a little sad or a little dark about it. We talked a lot about the pet kick the dog. Moving on, death by PowerPoint's almost over, I promise. So if you're trying to practice and you're having a hard time figuring out the flaw and how to create contrast, start with the bad guys. They often get the best lines. They're often the most fun. And don't just focus on the villain. Think about the antagonistic secondary characters. Think about not Draco, think about Umbridge or Voldemort. I don't know. I think Draco would probably be the antagonist in the first book, right? Voldemort's again like this big shadowy thing. The stormtroopers, what's motivating them? Is it good pay? Dental benefits? Why would you work for the Empire? They're jerks, right? Darth Vader's easy, I want to destroy it all or whatever. But think about, a secondary villain. What motivates them? I love it when a secondary villain has a change of heart. It's one of my favorite things in fiction. And I think you can get away with redemptions better, personally, again, this is David opinion, not, nothing I ever say should be taken as like, this is the way to do it. And anyone who tells you, again, this is the only way, run away. I think you have a hard time redeeming somebody like Darth Vader, who's destroyed planets, who've killed millions of people. That's not really redeemable. But Finn is a stormtrooper on his first mission, and he can't shoot innocent people, so he rebels. That's a cool moment. That's, he's like, I gotta do something. I gotta get out of here. I think you can have redemption, but I love it when somebody who's basically a bad person, but not completely bad, has that moment of, okay, that's enough. There's a line. So after you've gone through and thought about the flaw for your big bad guys, think about the little bad guys or the secondary bad guys. And again, the Empire, I get health benefits. My family has food. They brought order. I grew up on a poor, chaotic planet with lots of street fighting, and joining the Empire stopped all that. Maybe I see that as a good thing until I just don't anymore. Maybe I see a point when it ends. And then look at the good guys too. Why are they good guys? Could a good guy flip to bad? We think a lot about democracy in the States, but democracy is chaotic and it's hard. You have a good guy who just kind of gets tired of it and thinking, fascism would be easier. That's an unfortunate turn, but it could happen. Does the flaw, I, cis white male, can go hide and not confront racism if I want. What can a secondary character do? Can they pull back? Do they engage? Do they pull back? What do they gain or pay in those choices? Can you connect a hero to the flaw in a way that benefits them? Talked about that already. Blah, blah, blah. Boy, I really leaned on Harry Potter on this one. And then I'd like you to try to find a scene that is incredibly dark in your book and add just a little bit of beauty. Find a scene that even the darkest moment, just give it a little light to cast a little contrast. Find a scene that is totally upbeat and happy and throw a little sadness into it. It's the perfect wedding. It's all she's ever wanted. She's marrying the prince. It will unite their kingdoms, end the war. But she's sad because her mother didn't live to see it. As great as this is, she's a little sad because her mother didn't live to see it. He's been locked in the dungeon for the book he wrote, trying to tell the truth to the world to save it from the rising flood of demons. And he's been here for years. But he's come to appreciate the pattern in the stone because it reminds him of the mountain cliffs of his childhood. The Capitol in the Hunger Games is a beautiful, colorful place with all the makeup and hair, and it's an insidious, awful place. We love makeover scenes. This is something our psychology, by the way, we really like beauty scenes and makeover scenes. You'll see them a lot in young adult fiction, particularly. You see a lot like the Hunger Games, right? When she gets all the makeup and they polish off her scars. And you can see contrast in that too. For example, in Alex London's Proxy, the main character, who is poor and of color, the other characters, when he is unfortunately stuck in their world to a degree, offer to take away his scars, to beautify him. And he says no. He has to reject that. He would fit in better. It would actually help his disguise and his escape, but he won't sacrifice his skin for that. Such a compelling and important moment. No, because this is who I am. And then flip it around again. So show a bright scene with some sadness, show a dark scene with some beauty. And then even in the like good moment, can the flaw creep in a little? Yes, we have united our kingdoms through marriage. We have found peace, but the blight will eventually cost us the crops. We'll have to be prepared. Maybe you bought some time, maybe not forever. And if your main character is in that moment, maybe she's married the prince, she's united the kingdom, she's a little sad that her mom's not there, and everything is so perfect. And then she realizes one of the servants is being punished for stealing food. It's not perfect for everyone. Maybe that gloss and that glamour doesn't apply to everybody. I always think that's such an interesting way of looking at like the Fae. The Fae are so beautiful, but they have all of their own problems and they have all their own issues that they bring to the table that you don't often see because of all the glitter.